I was 13 years old when the evacuation siren went off, and I was already too far into the scrubland to hear it. That's the part nobody believes when I tell it. They picture a kid hiding under a bunk or crouching behind a door, listening to the boots and the shouting and the engines cycling up. They think I made some kind of decision. I didn't. I was 3 kilometers out past the colony's eastern fence, following a drainage channel I'd found 2 weeks earlier, because the channel led to a shelf of flat rock where the ground heat pooled in the evening and the small-boned creatures that lived in the root mass came out to sit in the warmth. I had a field notebook. I was drawing them. I wasn't paying attention to anything except the way one of them kept stealing food from a bigger one, and then pretending to look at the sky. By the time I noticed the smoke from the colony's direction and started running back, the last transport was already gone. The fence was still up. Emergency protocols had locked it on auto seal. I could see the empty landing pad through the mesh. I could see my family's quarters window dark. I stood at the fence for a long time, and then I went back to the colony, broke a window in the supply depot, and started figuring out what I had to work with. That was day one. I'm telling this to a review board, which means I'm supposed to give it in order and not skip things, so I'll try. But the honest version of the first week is mostly just scared, then less scared, then practical. The colony had been evacuated in stages over 48 hours. The contamination flag had gone up fast, the kind of fast that means something in the quarantine protocols got tripped and nobody stops to double check. So the supply depot was about 60% stocked. There was a water reclamation unit on the eastern block that was still running. Power cells were charged. The colony's main hub had emergency lighting and a communications array that was locked to outbound, only after evacuation, which meant I could hear the broadcast channel but couldn't transmit. I spent the first 3 days listening to people explain that Reach 7 sector was now under Containment Class 4 designation, which meant no entry, no exit, and a review period of not less than 90 days before any clearance team would assess. 90 days. I was 13. I did the math. I went back to the supply depot and I counted everything again, more carefully this time. The math worked out. Barely. 60% stocked for a colony of 43 people, now divided by one person, me, meant I had substantially more food than I needed for 90 days, assuming I was careful with the protein packs and used the dried ration stores first, which were dense and unpleasant but reliable. Water was a non-issue as long as the reclamation unit kept running, and the reclamation unit was a hardened piece of colonial infrastructure designed to keep running for up to 200 days without maintenance intervention. Power was the variable. The emergency lighting ran from the colony's buried cell array, which was at about 70% capacity, and the rate of draw from emergency systems alone was low enough that I estimated I had at minimum 120 days before I needed to worry about it. I wrote all of this down in the first few pages of my first field notebook, under the heading Resource Assessment, because the alternative was sitting in the supply depot thinking about my mother's face, and I had already decided I was not going to do that more than once a day. I want to be clear about something before I get to the rest of it, because I've heard the way people talk about the vel-skar and I want the record to say something different. When I was in that colony for the first week, alone, the things I was afraid of were the dark and the silence and the thought of my mother's face when she realized I wasn't on the transport. I was not afraid of the scrubland. I'd been going out into the scrubland for 8 months, since my family's resettlement placement had put us at Reach 7, and I'd been doing it without permission because my parents would have said no, and I'd have had to sit inside a colony module and stare at walls. The scrubland at Reach 7 was not a friendly place. The ecology was dense and layered, and most of the animals in it were built to eat each other. But it wasn't hostile to me in any way I understood as personal. It was just a place that had its own rules, and I'd spent 8 months learning the edges of those rules. The vel-skar were part of those rules. I'd seen them 3 times before the evacuation. Once at distance, through the drainage channel, where I'd caught movement in the root mass and sat very still and eventually made out a shape that was bigger than anything I'd catalogued, low, four-limbed, moving in a way that was more fluid than it should have been for something that size, like its joints had one extra degree of bend that mammal joints don't have. Twice more after that, closer, because once I knew roughly where their range was, I started paying attention to tracks and scat and disturbance patterns in the vegetation. I'd filled half a field notebook on them by the time the evacuation happened. I knew they hunted in coordinated groups. I knew the juveniles were a different color than the adults, darker, with a banding pattern that faded as they aged. I knew they marked territory with a glandular secretion that smelled like hot copper and pine resin, which sounds unpleasant, but was actually not that bad once you got used to it. I knew they had a heat sense organ arrangement on their faces, a shallow arc of pits above the jawline, and that these pits oriented toward a target with a precision that suggested they were not merely supplementary to vision but primary in low-light conditions. What I did not know, going into day 8, was that the vel-skar had denning sites inside the colony perimeter. I found this out because I had spent a week eating ration packs and sleeping in the supply depot, and it had occurred to me that I should check the maintenance crawl spaces under the eastern block, because the water reclamation unit occasionally needed manual bypass when the filter columns got clogged, and I had watched the maintenance tech do it twice, and thought I could probably manage it if I needed to. I went under the eastern block with a light, and I found the filter access panel, and I also found that something had been living in the crawl space long enough to compress the insulation, padding into a nest shape approximately 2 meters across. Whatever had made the nest was not currently in it. I backed out of the crawl space and stood in the eastern block corridor for a while. The smell of hot copper and pine resin was very faint, but it was there. I went back to the supply depot and did not sleep especially well that night. On day 9, I saw the first one clearly. I'd moved my sleeping arrangement to the supply depot's upper storage level, which had a row of ventilation slats that I could see through without being visible from below, and just before dawn something moved through the corridor outside that was low and wide and taking its time. It paused below my ventilation slats, and I stopped breathing, and it stood there for long enough that I counted to 47 before it moved on. I never saw its face. What I saw was the top of its back, the ridged spine line, the color of old charcoal with a faint iridescent sheen where the dawn light caught it, the muscles moving under the skin in a way that made it look like something was always about to happen. Then it was gone. I spent day 9 not doing anything I had planned to do. Day 10, I spent at my workbench writing down what I knew, what I'd observed pre-evacuation, and what the current evidence suggested. The nesting site inside the perimeter, pre-existing, established before the evacuation, which meant the colony had been sharing its footprint with vel-skar denning activity for however long the colony had been there, without anyone apparently noticing, because nobody had been crawling through the maintenance spaces looking. That seemed like a significant gap in the colony's ecological survey. I wrote it down. I had to do something with the information, and there was nobody to tell it to accept the page. Day 11, I went back to the eastern block and checked the crawl space again. The nest had been used overnight. The insulation padding held warmth for longer than the ambient temperature could account for. I put my hand on it. Recent. Hours, not days. On day 12, things changed. I'd gotten careful about routines by day 12. I moved at irregular times. I didn't take the same path twice in a row. I kept my light use minimal at night and stayed away from the eastern block after dark. This was not a system I designed consciously. It was the system you arrive at when you've been observing animals in their territory for long enough that you start thinking in their terms. I wasn't afraid of the vel-skar, exactly. I was being sensible. On day 12, I was at the water reclamation unit running the morning cycle when I heard a sound from the equipment room adjacent, a sound that was not mechanical. It was a low, intermittent sound, almost rhythmic, somewhere between a click and a hum. I stood very still. The sound continued. After a while, I identified it as coming from behind the secondary coolant housing, which was a large enclosed space that the maintenance techs used for tool storage. The door was slightly ajar. I am not going to pretend I made a rational decision. I looked through the gap in the door because I am 13 and curiosity is, as my mother has told me approximately 9,000 times, a serious character flaw. There were two vel-skar juveniles in the tool storage room. They were not the size I had estimated from the adults. They were smaller, much smaller, each about the size of a large dog, though longer and lower, with the banding pattern I'd noted in my field notebook. They were curled around each other in the corner behind the tool rack, and the sound I'd heard was coming from the one on top, which was trembling slightly and making that low clicking hum in a way that seemed involuntary. The one underneath it was very still. I stood in the doorway for what felt like a long time. Then I went back to the supply depot, and I found the emergency medical kit, and I looked through it for anything that might be generally applicable to a warm-blooded animal of unknown biology, and I brought back the thermal blanket and a half ration of the soft protein pack that was meant for people who'd had dental surgery, because it was the closest thing to easily digestible that I had. And I went back to the door, and I set both things down inside the threshold, and I backed away, and I sat down in the corridor and I waited. It took 4 hours. The juvenile on top, the one that was trembling, eventually turned its head and looked at me. Its eyes were amber, very pale at the center, and they caught the light from the corridor lamp in a way that made them look briefly like they were lit from inside. It looked at me for a long time. Then it moved toward the threshold slowly, keeping its body low, and it put its nose to the protein pack and pulled back immediately. Then it went forward again and put its nose to the thermal blanket. Then it picked up the thermal blanket in its mouth, dragged it back to its companion, and arranged it with considerable care over the still one. Then it looked at me again. I stayed in the corridor. On day 13, it ate the protein pack. I don't know what was wrong with the still juvenile. It was alive, I could see its sides moving, but it didn't get up for 3 days. I kept bringing food and water, both for the sick one and for the other one, and the other one ate steadily and seemed to be deciding something about me in a very deliberate and systematic way. It would come to the threshold. It would look at me. It would look at the food. It would look at me again. Then it would eat, without rushing, and then it would go back to its companion, and I would hear the clicking hum start again. On day 16, the sick one stood up. On day 17, the adult came. I was in the water reclamation room, and I heard the sound before I saw anything, a low, resonant sound, not like the juvenile's clicking but deeper, something that I felt more in my chest than heard with my ears. I turned around, and there was a vel-skar adult in the doorway, full grown, approximately 2.5 meters long from nose to the base of its tail, standing at shoulder height that would have put its head level with my sternum if it had been standing straight instead of crouching in the doorway, which it was, because the doorway was sized for colonial architecture and not for the dimensions of a mature vel-skar. Its eyes were darker than the juvenile's, amber gone almost to gold, very steady. It was not making the deep sound anymore. It was just looking at me. I did not run. This was partly because I'd read enough about predator behavior to know that running was a poor choice. It was partly because my legs were not entirely willing to cooperate. But it was mostly, and I want the board to understand this, because after 16 days alone in an evacuated colony, the sight of something alive and warm-blooded and looking at me with steady attention was not primarily frightening. It was something else. I don't have a good word for it. It was like being recognized. I put my hands at my sides. I kept my eyes soft, not staring directly, not looking away, the way you look at something you're not trying to challenge. I stayed still. The adult vel-skar looked at me for a very long time. Then it made a sound that was quieter than the first one, shorter, lower, and then it turned and went back the way it had come. The juveniles started spending time outside the tool storage room after that. I learned their names, not their real names. I assumed they had those in whatever way vel-skar communicate, but the names I gave them. The sick one I called Still, because that had been the first thing I knew about it. The other one I called Copper because of the smell. Copper was the curious one, the pushy one, the one that would come entirely into the corridor and then into the main reclamation room, and then eventually into the supply depot, and sit 4 feet away from me, and watch me eat my ration pack, as though my eating habits were a subject of active study. Still was more cautious, but in a thoughtful way rather than a fearful one. It would stay at the threshold and observe whatever Copper was doing, and then, once it had apparently assessed the situation, it would come forward and do the same thing, slightly more efficiently. By day 20, Copper had begun to follow me on my supply depot rounds. Not closely, it kept about 6 feet of distance, and it stopped whenever I stopped and moved when I moved, which gave the whole arrangement the slightly uncanny quality of a shadow that hadn't learned to stay underfoot. I logged this in the field notebook under behavioral observation, following behavior. I noted that it never tried to cut off my path or position itself between me and a doorway, which I thought was probably meaningful. It was curious, not corrective. It wanted to know where I was going and what I did when I got there. It was not trying to manage me. By day 25, Copper had learned that I kept my field notebook in my left jacket pocket and would occasionally try to extract it. I let it succeed twice before I started keeping the notebook in my right pocket, and then it learned about my right pocket, and then I started keeping it inside my jacket, and then Copper figured out the zipper. I wrote about this in the notebook. I wrote, "They learn faster than I expect, and what they learn they don't forget." Day 28 was when I first tried to go into the scrubland with Copper behind me. I had not planned this. I had gone out through the eastern gate in the early morning to do a vegetation survey of the sector I designated Grid East 3, and I was 400 meters out when I realized Copper was keeping pace with me at the same 6-foot distance it maintained inside the colony. I stopped. Copper stopped. I turned around and looked at it. It looked at me. Its heat-sense pits were oriented east, ahead of me, in the direction I'd been walking, and it held that orientation for a moment before turning its attention back to me. I turned back around and kept walking. Copper came with me. It maintained the 6-foot distance for the first kilometer, and then, gradually, as we got deeper into the scrubland's root mass and the territory became denser and more complex, it began to drift closer. Not because it was afraid, I don't think. Because the terrain required it. The root structures came in at angles that narrowed the path, and Copper was now large enough that fitting through some of them at 6 feet behind me would have required a course correction that at 3 feet didn't. By the time we reached Grid East 3, it was moving at my shoulder. I did my survey. Copper investigated everything I investigated, slightly before I did, which meant that when I went to look at a particular growth formation or pick up a soil sample, Copper had already sniffed it, assessed it with the heat-sense pits, and either moved on or was still examining it, in which case I waited. This was the first time I thought of it as a working arrangement rather than a following behavior. I have written this in the field notebook under preliminary social structure hypothesis. I may be inside the pack's range. But Copper's behavior suggests the relationship is structured as mutual territory sharing, rather than one-sided tolerance. The adult appeared on that day too, materialized from the root mass ahead of us at a distance of about 30 meters and walked parallel to my path for approximately 2 kilometers, staying at that distance until I turned back toward the colony. Then it went in a different direction. It did this every time I went out after that. I wrote in my field notebook, I think this is what being included in a territory looks like. Day 32, I tested this. I went east into Grid East 4, which was at the edge of the range I'd mapped and further than I'd gone before. The adult came from the route mass earlier than usual at 300 meters, not the customary 500, and its parallel course was tighter, maybe 20 meters closer to me than the established pattern. It didn't do anything except walk. But the tighter proximity and the earlier appearance told me something about what Grid East 4 meant to the territory, and I turned back at 2.5 kilometers instead of 3. The next day the adult picked up at the normal distance. I wrote the boundary is not a line, it's a negotiation. Day 36 I was out in Grid East 2 with Copper, which had become standard by then, Copper as a working presence on the morning surveys when we came across a carcass. Something large, six-limbed from the scrubland's upper canopy, brought down and mostly consumed. I crouched to look at it. Copper sat beside me and made a sound I hadn't catalogued before, short, low, once. Then it looked at me. Then it looked at the carcass. Then it looked back toward the colony. I thought about this for a moment. Then I stood up and we walked back. I wrote, either it was telling me lunch was handled, or it was telling me this was not my food. I'm not sure the distinction matters as much as the communication does. By day 40, the adult had started doing something new. On 3 occasions when I was in the supply depot at night, reading by emergency light, working through the 6th notebook, not doing anything that would have registered as unusual, the adult came to the depot's exterior wall and stood there for a period, and I could hear it, and then it made the check-in sound and left. It was checking on me at night now, not just during the day surveys. I don't know what changed its assessment to include that. I recorded it and didn't speculate, because in the field notebook I tried to record what I observed rather than what I thought. But privately, this is not in the notebook. I thought it was because the nights had gotten colder, and the colony's heating systems were running lower, and there had been 2 nights where the temperature inside the supply depot had dropped low enough that I'd slept in all my layers and still woken up stiff. I think it was checking that I was still warm. I am recording this for the review board because the board has asked for my complete account, and this is part of it. Copper and Still were growing. I noticed it first in their legs. Vel-skar juveniles apparently put their growth into their legs before their bodies catch up, so there was a period of about 2 weeks where they looked slightly comical, all leg and shoulder, and not quite enough body to justify it. Then the body caught up. By day 35, I started having to reconsider which colony spaces could comfortably accommodate them. The tool storage room had been their base, but by day 38 Copper was no longer fitting under the secondary coolant housing without conscious effort, and by day 42 it had stopped trying and had annexed a corner of the main equipment room instead. Still, slightly smaller, held on in the tool storage room for another week before it migrated to the crawl space under the eastern block, which it had apparently decided was a suitable upgrade from the juvenile nest its size had by then far outgrown. By day 40, the top of Copper's back came to my hip. By day 45, it came to my waist. Still was slightly smaller but gaining fast. They were not cute. I want to be precise about this because I've seen the way people talk about cubs and juveniles of predator species, and there's a tendency to soften things, to make them sound like large dogs or friendly cats. Copper and Still were not large dogs. Their jaws were articulated differently from anything I'd seen on Earth, a secondary hinge point that let them open to an angle that should not have been anatomically possible. Their feet were wider than my spread hand with the fingers extended, and each foot had 4 load-bearing digits with a retractable structure at the tip that I did not ever see deployed, but that I observed in the collapsed position, and that I recorded in my field notebook with the note, do not ever do anything to prompt the extended version. Their heat sense organs, a set of facial pits arranged in a shallow arc above the jaw, were visible when the light caught them right, dark against the darker charcoal of their skin, and when they were tracking something those pits oriented toward it in a way that was very precise and slightly unnerving. But they were also the things that had sat with me through 47 days of an evacuated colony, and had learned the zipper on my jacket, and had, on one memorable evening, both attempted to fit inside the supply depot at the same time, and gotten briefly stuck in the doorway together. which had required a certain amount of awkward shuffling to resolve, and which I had written about in my field notebook under the heading Architectural Incompatibility. And they were the things that had, without being asked, begun to sleep in the supply depot corridor on the nights when the temperature dropped particularly hard. They generated considerable warmth, and the corridor was, on those nights, a significantly more comfortable place than it had been before they decided to use it. I had not asked them to do this. They had decided it was part of the arrangement. I was not going to argue. On day 47, the military came. I heard them before I saw them, engine noise, high and fast, coming from the north. I was on the flat rock shelf east of the colony, doing my morning observation, and I looked up and counted 3 tactical transport craft coming in low and hard over the scrubland canopy. They weren't landing at the colony pad. They were doing a sweep pattern, which meant they were looking for something specific. Copper was beside me on the rock shelf, doing what it had taken to doing in the mornings, lying flat with its chin on its front feet, oriented east, watching the small-boned creatures in the root mass with what I had come to identify as speculative interest rather than active hunting intent. The moment the engine sound registered, Copper was upright. Its heat-sense pits snapped north. Its posture shifted in a way I had not seen before, lower at the shoulder, wider-based, all the looseness gone out of it. Not a threat posture, exactly, not the way I understood that term. More like the posture of something that had just become very serious about what was happening. Still was 10 meters back, half inside a root cluster. It came out and oriented the same way. I put my hand on Copper's back, not a restraining gesture, more like a steadying one, and Copper went very still under my hand, its heat-sense pits continuing to track the aircraft, following their arc as they began the tighter circle that meant they were choosing a landing site. "I know," I said to Copper, "I know." I don't know if it understood the words. I know it understood the tone. The transports set down about a kilometer north of the colony perimeter. I went back to the colony fast, with Copper beside me and still close behind, and I got inside the fence and into the supply depot, and I climbed to the upper storage level, and I looked out through the ventilation slats. The military team came through the colony's north gate 17 minutes later. 12 people, full tactical kit, suits sealed, environmental filtration running, weapons in the active position. A lead officer in a different grade of kit, slightly ahead of the others. They were moving in a professional pattern, fanning out across the colony hub, and I could see they were doing a systematic search. For me, I assumed. Someone had finally counted heads and figured out I wasn't on the transport. I started to stand up. I was going to go down, show myself, go home. Then I heard what the lead officer said to the soldier beside him, and I sat back down. Secondary objective is termination of any vel-skar contacts within the perimeter. We have authority under the quarantine protocol to clear the zone ahead of the orbital strike window. Anything with a heat signature that isn't human, you put it down. Clear. Clear, they said, clear. I sat in the upper storage level and I looked at Copper, who was beside me with its heat-sense pits oriented down at the soldiers moving through the colony hub below. And I thought about Still, who was somewhere in the eastern block crawl space, where it had started spending its afternoons now that it was too large for the tool storage room. And I thought about the adult, who had a range that took it across the entire eastern sector. I thought about 47 days. I thought about day 12, and the door to the tool storage room, and the thermal blanket dragged carefully over a sick companion. I thought about day 28, and Copper at my shoulder in grid East 3, examining the same vegetation samples I was examining, moving through the root mass with its heat-sense pits active, and its attention genuinely divided between the terrain ahead and what I was doing at any given moment. I thought about the quality of attention that was not protective, exactly, not in any simple way, but oriented, aware of where I was in the space between us. I thought about 6 field notebooks, and what was in them, and what it had taken to learn what was in them, and what it meant that nobody else had bothered. I stayed very still. The lead officer's name was Commander Vrast. I learned this because they used names over their comm channel and I was above them listening. Vrast was methodical. He swept the colony hub in 40 minutes, found my sleeping arrangement in the upper storage level of the depot. I had moved it before they arrived. I don't know exactly why, instinct more than plan, and noted that the occupant had left recently. He found my field notebooks. I had 6 of them by that point, stacked on the workbench I'd claimed in the secondary storage room, and they were full of observations about vel-skar morphology, territory patterns, feeding behavior, and what I now knew about their social structure and communication. He picked one up. He read a few pages. He put it down. "Survivor is mobile," he said into his comm. "Has been for a while by the look of it. Doesn't seem to know we're here yet, or knows and is avoiding contact." The soldier beside him, a woman from the voice, whose name I gathered was Sen, said, "Sir, these field notes are detailed. Whoever wrote these has been observing the vel-skar at close range. If they've established any kind of relationship with the pack, then they've been contaminating a Class 4 quarantine site for 47 days, Vrast said. Find the survivor. We debrief them on the transport and we close out the site. Clock is running." I knew what the clock was. I'd been listening to the broadcast channel. The orbital strike window was a 72-hour authorization. They needed the site cleared before the window closed. After the window, the protocol reevaluated, and there might not be another authorization for months. Vrast wanted this done today. I lay flat in the ventilation space, and I thought very clearly for about 2 minutes. Copper was beside me. I put my hand on Copper's side, and I felt the slow, even movement of its breathing, and the warmth of it through my jacket. And I thought about the sound the adult made when it came to check on the juveniles, that short, low sound. Not a growl, something quieter. And I thought about still arranged with the thermal blanket, and the zipper, and the flat rock shelf in the evenings with the small-boned creatures doing what they did, and 47 days. Then I thought about 12 soldiers with active weapons, and a termination order and a clock. Then I thought about what I knew about the quarantine zone, that 12 soldiers in sealed environmental suits, who had been on the ground for under an hour, did not know. I moved to the corner of the ventilation space, and I pressed my mouth to the slat, and I made the sound, the short, low sound, the one the adult used, or my best approximation of it, which was imperfect but recognizable enough that Copper's head turned toward me immediately. I made it again. Copper listened. I pointed toward the eastern block, away from where the soldiers were concentrated. Copper looked where I pointed. Its heat sense pits oriented in that direction. Then it slipped off the storage level platform in a way that was quieter than anything its size should have been able to manage, and it went. I waited 90 seconds. Then I climbed down from the upper storage level, walked to the supply depot's main door, and stepped outside. "Hey," I said to the 2 soldiers who were conducting a sweep of the depot's exterior. "I'm Save. I've been here since the evacuation. Where do I sign to get off this rock?" They were not expecting me from behind them. They were not expecting me to sound bored. Soldiers working a quarantine sweep of an apparently empty colony site develop a certain focus. They're looking at angles and shadows and thermal readings, and they are not expecting a 13-year-old to walk up behind them and open a conversation like he's inquiring about transport schedules. Both of them startled. One of them said something into his comm. Vrast arrived in 4 minutes. He was not as tall as I'd expected from the voice. He was professional, I'll give him that, and his first questions were the right questions. Are you injured? Are you in distress? Have you had any contact with contamination vectors, meaning anything that qualified under the quarantine flag? I answered them in order. No. No. Define contamination vector. Any biological material from non-human sources, he said. Any animal contact, any exposure to the local fauna. I looked at him, he looked at me. I've been alone in an evacuated colony for 47 days, I said. I've been going into the scrubland. I've had contact with the local fauna. I've had extensive contact with the local fauna. I have 6 field notebooks about it. His expression changed in a way that was hard to read through the environmental suit's faceplate, but I read it as this just got complicated. We're going to need to assess that, he said. Come with me to the transport. I'm not going to the transport, I said. There was a pause. Son, Vrast said, you are the survivor of a Class 4 quarantine event and you need to be extracted and evaluated. This is not a discussion. I'm not your son, I said, and I have 6 field notebooks worth of data on a species that your quarantine protocol has flagged for termination based on what I can only assume is a contamination classification that was generated by a sensor array, and not by anybody who has actually been in contact with the vel-skar for any length of time. I'd like to have a conversation about that before we talk about where I'm going. Vrast looked at the soldier on his left, who I'd identified as Sen, and Sen looked back at him with an expression that I couldn't fully read, but that seemed to contain some information about the inadvisability of the current conversational direction. The termination order is issued under quarantine protocol, Vrast said, and it is not subject to review on the ground. The species has been classified as a contamination vector, and the site will be cleared. Your welfare is my primary concern here, and I need you to. That's when the deep sound came from the Eastern Bloc. Not from one vel-skar, from several. The adult's resonant chest note, and underneath it copper's slightly higher pitch, and under that stills, and at the edges of the frequency something that I hadn't heard before, 2 or 3 additional voices that I had not catalogued, which meant there were adults in the pack that I hadn't encountered directly, which meant the vel-skar were not 3 animals but something considerably larger. Every soldier in the courtyard went still. Contact, someone said into a comm channel, and the word came out wrong, too clipped, too high. The word of someone who had trained for this moment but whose body had not previously experienced the sensation of a sound that you felt in your chest wall coming from multiple directions simultaneously in an enclosed space. Hold, Vrast said. His voice was professional. I gave him credit for it. I looked at the Eastern Bloc and I looked at the Northern Colonnade, and I looked at the gap between the supply depot and the secondary storage building, and I counted the shapes that were present in each of those locations. The shapes that had been there, at heat sense range, since before the soldiers arrived, which I had known because I knew the territory patterns, which I knew because I'd been paying attention for 47 days. 7 adults, minimum. The 2 juveniles somewhere behind the Eastern Bloc, out of direct sight. The pack had been in position before the transports had finished spinning down. Commander Vrast, I said, I would like to suggest that you put your weapons in the passive position. Son, I know what I said about son. I'm saying it anyway. Put your weapons in the passive position, please. The vel-skar respond to active position weapons as a territorial claim signal, the same signal they use when a competing pack crosses into their range. You are inside their range. You have been since the North Gate. They have been watching you for approximately 40 minutes and they have not moved toward you, which tells you something about their default behavioral state. What I am asking you to do is not take an action that will change that assessment. There was a silence. I watched Vrast process this. Sen said quietly, Sir, the survivor has 47 days of direct behavioral data and we have, she glanced at her wrist unit, 11 hours on site. Vrast looked at her. He looked at me. He looked at the Eastern Bloc, where the largest adult was now fully visible in the doorway, standing at rest but oriented directly toward the courtyard, its heat-sense pits moving in a slow arc across the soldiers arranged below it. He put his weapon in the passive position. He signaled his team to do the same. The sound dropped, not all at once but in stages, the additional voices first, then stills, then coppers. until only the adult was making any sound at all, and then that stopped too. The adult in the eastern block doorway stayed where it was. It was looking at Vrast, I thought. Its heat sense pits were oriented on him specifically, in a way that made it feel less like passive observation and more like an assessment in progress. "Thank you," I said. "Now, can we talk about the termination order?" We talked about the termination order. It took 3 hours. It took 3 hours because Vrast was operating under a protocol authorization that required specific conditions to modify, and modifying it on the ground required documentation that he had to file through the command channel. And command had questions, and those questions required answers, and the answers required me to explain, in some detail, what I had learned about vel-skar ecology and social structure, and behavior over 47 days of direct observation, none of which was in any existing xenobiology database, because nobody had ever spent 47 days inside a vel-skar territory with a field notebook, and the sense to be quiet and pay attention. I explained the territory boundary markings, how far east the scent markers ran, and what they indicated about pack range. I explained the denning sites, including the one inside the colony perimeter, which predated the colony's establishment by what I estimated was at least 2 growing seasons based on the degree of compression in the nesting material. I explained the pack structure as I understood it, the senior adult, the working adults, the juveniles, and the communication patterns I had transcribed across 6 notebooks. I explained that the contamination flag that had triggered the evacuation and the quarantine designation had, as far as I could reconstruct from the broadcast channel communications I've been able to monitor, been generated by a passive biosensor array at the colony's north perimeter, which was positioned at the edge of the vel-skar's territory boundary. A biosensor at a territory boundary would capture vel-skar in an active territorial response state. That was not their baseline state. Their baseline state was what I had been observing for 47 days, which was considerably more measured. During hour 2 of this conversation, Copper walked into the courtyard. This was not planned. I want to be clear about that. Copper made its own decisions about where it went and when, and it had decided, apparently, that 2 hours was long enough to observe from the eastern block doorway, and that a closer assessment of the newcomers was warranted. It came into the courtyard at the unhurried pace that meant it had already decided the situation was not threatening. That specific loose-jointed gait it used when it was moving towards something that interested it rather than something that required caution. And it went directly to the supply depot wall where I was sitting, because I had sat down on the wall's edge partway through hour 2 because my legs were tired. It put its head against my shoulder. I kept talking. I was explaining thermal sense range and pack communication patterns to a relay officer at command who was typing very quickly. Copper made a low sound. I put my hand on the back of its neck without looking down and kept talking. 17 soldiers in full tactical kit were looking at this. Not all of them at once. They were professionals. They were maintaining their positions. But I could see, in the peripheral way you develop when you've spent 47 days being aware of where everything around you is at any given moment, that each of them was tracking what Copper was doing. Some of them were very carefully not looking directly, which was the correct instinct. A few of them were past that, and had arrived at a kind of still, concentrated attention that I recognized as the thing that happens when something real overrides the thing you'd prepared for. Sen, who had sat down across from me and was taking her own notes, said quietly, "How long has it been doing that?" 46 days, I said. Since day 2, it's the curious one. I heard someone in the tactical group say something under his breath. I didn't catch all of it, but I caught the word kid. At the end of hour 3, command modified the termination authorization. Not eliminated, modified. The vel-skar were reclassified from contamination vector pending termination to indeterminate species under field review, which was a classification that required a proper xenobiology assessment before any further action, and which carried a mandatory stay on the orbital strike window until that assessment was completed. The assessment would take, at minimum, 60 days. 60 days, Vrast informed me, would require a field station. A field station would require personnel. The xenobiology division would have to send someone. Vrast looked like a man who had come to close a site, and was now going to have to write a report explaining why the site was not closed. The field notes are the evidentiary basis for the reclassification, he said to me. I need those notebooks. I'll give you copies, I said. I'm keeping the originals. He looked at me. He looked at Copper, who was still leaning against my shoulder, and had, at some point during hour 2, relocated most of its weight onto my lap in a way that was making it difficult for me to breathe efficiently. You're 13, he said. I know, I said. I've been here 47 days. That's about 23 days longer than your xenobiology division has spent on this species in any recorded observation period, including the preliminary survey that generated the original contamination flag. The notebooks are mine. There was a pause. Copies, Vrast said. Copies, I agreed. Still came into the courtyard during the photography session for the copies. It went to the corner near the secondary storage building and sat there, and watched the proceedings with the particular quality of attention it always brought to things, which was thorough and systematic and not visibly emotional in either direction. One of the soldiers, a young man on the eastern flank who had spent the last 3 hours very carefully not looking directly at any of the vel-skar, which was the correct instinct, glanced over at Still, and then looked at me. Is that one named too? He said. Still, I said. He looked at Still for a moment. Why Still? It was sick when I found it, I said. It stayed very still. It got better. He was quiet for a moment. How long ago was that? Day 12. He looked at Still again. The height of it now, the breadth of shoulder, the way its head turned slowly toward him as it registered his direct attention with the patient precision of something that misses nothing. He looked back at me. It's a lot bigger than it was on day 12, he said. Growing fast, I said. They both are. The adult appeared on the colonnade above the courtyard at some point during the copying session, and several soldiers noticed it at the same time, and there was a moment of collective stillness in the courtyard that was not quite alarm, but was adjacent to it. That sensation of realizing the observed and the observer have exchanged positions, and you are now the one being assessed. The adult looked at the courtyard from the colonnade for approximately 3 minutes. Then it went back into the colony's upper level, unhurried. It's been doing that the whole time, I said to Vrast, who was watching the colonnade even after the adult had gone. Coming to check. It does it with me too. It makes a sound when it's done, like it's saying everything's fine, and then it leaves. And when it's not fine, Vrast said. I don't know, I said. I've never seen it decide something wasn't fine. He looked at me with an expression that I thought was probably supposed to be unreadable. Until today, I offered. He didn't answer that. The transports left in the late afternoon, with my copied field notebooks, with Vrast's modified authorization filed through command, and with 11 soldiers who had spent a day in a quarantine zone that was supposed to be a straightforward sweep-in close and who were leaving it open. Sen was the last one to the north gate. She stopped and looked back at the courtyard, where Copper was sitting in the late light with its head up, watching the transports cycle their engines. It'll be 60 days before the xenobiology team gets here, she said to me. Probably longer. Are you staying? I'm staying, I said. She looked at Copper. She looked at me. 60-day field rations, she said, and she set down a supply pack at the gate. Don't argue. And for what it's worth, she paused, and I thought she was going to say something official, something procedural. For what it's worth, they should have counted heads before they sealed the fence. Yes, I said, they should have. She left. I'm giving this account to a review board, a different review board than the one that evaluated the xenobiology team's findings, and a different one than the one that processed the reclassification of the vel-skar from indeterminate species to protected contact status, which is where they currently sit as a classification. This review board wants to know about the military team's conduct because someone has apparently filed a report. I'm told it came from within the command structure, though I don't know who, noting that a termination order was modified on the basis of testimony from a minor and a set of field notebooks, and questioning whether the modification was procedurally appropriate. I'll tell you what I told the other boards. Commander Vrast followed his protocol. When the protocol was shown to be operating on insufficient data, he updated. When Command offered a modification pathway, he used it. I don't have a complaint about Commander Vrast. He came in with a termination order and a clock, and he left with neither, and I think that reflects well on him rather than poorly. The protocol itself is a different matter, and that's not this board's jurisdiction. What I can tell you, for the record, is this. vel-skar did not attack anyone, not in 47 days of sharing a colony site with me, and not in the hours that a 12-person tactical team in full weapons kit swept through their territory with active weapons drawn. They held. They assessed. They made sounds that were communicating something. I have transcribed them as best I can in the field notebooks, and the xenobiology team has since characterized them as territorial claim displays rather than aggression vectors, which matches what I observed. The holding assessment lasted exactly as long as the threat posture lasted. When Vrast stood his team down, they stood down. I have 6.5 field notebooks now. The xenobiology team arrived on day 94, and I spent 11 days going over everything with the lead researcher, a woman named Dr. Vane, who said more than once that the preliminary survey data that had generated the contamination flag was based on passive sensor readings from outside the territory boundary and represented the vel-skar in a state of active territorial response to an intrusive monitoring array, which is not their baseline behavioral state. Their baseline behavioral state, as documented in my notebooks, and as Dr. Vane has since formalized in the initial species assessment, is considerably more measured. The territory I surveyed with the adults escort covers approximately 40 square kilometers of eastern Reach 7. The pack consists of 7 adults, including the one I had direct contact with, and the 2 juveniles Copper and Still, who are now Dr. Vane's measurement, taken on day 98, approximately 63% of adult size and gaining. She says the growth rate will slow. I am not entirely sure I believe her, but I am recording it here for the board's reference. The orbital strike window expired without authorization. The site is currently under protected contact quarantine, which means restricted access and a monitoring requirement rather than a termination protocol. The xenobiology team has a field station on the northern edge of the eastern grid. I have been asked, pending my family's formal consent, to remain as a junior research associate for the duration of the initial assessment period, on account of having the most extensive behavioral observation record on the species currently in existence. My parents have not yet formally decided. My mother has asked 3 times whether Copper and Still are dangerous. I have explained 3 times that dangerous is a description that depends very much on context and on what the animal in question has decided about you, and that in my experience and in the formal language of the preliminary species assessment, the vel-skar make those decisions carefully and hold to them consistently. My mother has then said, each time, that she is not sure this is reassuring. I don't know how to make it more reassuring than it is. I can only tell you what I saw. I can tell you that a 12-person tactical team with active weapons and a termination order spent a day inside of vel-skar territory and left without a casualty, and that what stood between the 2 outcomes was not force of any kind. It was 47 days of paying attention. It was a thermal blanket and a protein pack and a copper-smelling juvenile in a tool storage room, and 6 notebooks full of careful observation, and a review board that eventually listened to a 13-year-old who had been accidentally marooned in a Class 4 quarantine zone and had, in the intervening 47 days, done what anyone with a field notebook and basic observational instincts would do, which is learn the rules of the place they were in. Commander Vrast filed a report explaining why his 12-person team did not complete the termination sweep. I understand it runs to 40 pages. I understand that the section on species behavioral assessment references my field notebooks extensively. I have been told by Sen, who sends occasional updates through the command channel, that there is a running joke in Vrast's unit about what they are now calling the notebook standard, the informal term for the minimum period of direct behavioral observation that should be required before a quarantine termination order is authorized against an uncontacted species. The notebook standard, as the joke goes, is 47 days. The minimum required under the current protocol, which generated the contamination flag on a passive sensor reading taken from outside the territory boundary, was 0. I don't think the protocol change is a joke. I have submitted a formal written account to the Xenobiology Division's review panel. Dr. Vane has co-signed it. It is in progress. What I was not afraid of was copper and still. What I was not afraid of was the adult, standing in the water reclamation room doorway making its check-in sound. What I was not afraid of was a species that had, over 47 days, made a clear and consistent decision about me, had chosen me, in whatever way those decisions work for them, and had then stuck to it with the kind of reliability that I had not found in abundance anywhere else during that particular stretch of my life. The board is going to make its recommendation about the protocol modification. I'll leave that to the board. What I'm asking is that the record reflect the following, clearly and without qualification. The vel-skar were there first. They were there when I arrived, and they were there when the tactical team arrived, and they are there now. The territory is theirs. What they extended to me, and what they declined to withdraw even when the situation gave them reason to, was a form of inclusion that I recorded as carefully as I could in 6.5 field notebooks, and that I am now describing to you as accurately as I know how. I would like the record to say they chose well. I think it's true, and I think they'd want it on file. That's all I have.